Hi everyone. So starting off today's lesson with this really interesting graph from Twitter, from the Met Office Twitter feed. And this is looking at, according to your age, what percentage of fossil fuel CO2 emissions you have experienced. And this is looking at the period from 1751. So if you are 15, you've experienced more than 30% of those emissions that have happened since 1751. Somebody who's 50 has experienced more than 70% of those emissions. And somebody who's 85 has experienced 90% of those emissions. I think that's quite a stark graph to look at and to think about how much of those emissions are concentrated into a very short space of time, especially when you think about the grand scale of the Earth's complete history. So what we need to look at, this is actually the last lesson in this module. We need to have a look at the international agreements that have been used in order to try to reduce carbon emissions. And we need to look at these agreements critically. How successful have they been? And ultimately, climate change is a global problem. It affects all of us. Solving the problem, therefore, is going to require international cooperation. And when we look at what's happened so far, it's been pretty patchy. There have been a variety of different economic and political reasons that some of the world's largest emitters have decided not to follow a pathway of international agreement and to try to reduce their emissions, and have rather focused on their own economic development and their own self-interest as a country. But we are in the situation where global atmospheric CO2 is at an all-time high, and the United Nations is warning that we need to take drastic action against this. So one of the big issues in recent times has been this man, Donald Trump. It's kind of quite well known that he is somebody who doesn't believe in global warming, and he's had some very high profile quotes. For example, a few years ago he said, "It's snowing in Texas and Louisiana, record-setting freezing temperatures throughout the country and beyond. Global warming is an expensive hoax." And lots of people taking the mickey out of him for confusing, at that stage, weather and climate. Just because the particular weather on one day is cold and freezing, that is not an indicator at all of climate, which, as we know, is looking at the larger scale, the longer scale patterns of precipitation and temperature. He also famously said, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make United States manufacturing non-competitive." So sort of saying that it's all a big hoax in order to try to bring down the US economy. But actually, when we look at it, the United States is the biggest emitter when we look per capita. And there's an article there that looks at the fact that the Pentagon emits more greenhouse gases than the whole country of Portugal. And one of the issues has been, if America isn't on board with an international agreement as the largest emitter in the world, that really undermines what everybody else is trying to do. So the first significant international agreement was back in 1997. And this was the Kyoto Protocol, so called because that was where it was signed. And most developed countries at that point agreed to targets to reduce their emissions. However, what they decided to do was only to set targets for those countries that they deemed to be developed at that point. So if you were a developing country, then you weren't set any targets. And that meant that China and India were not set any targets because they were not considered to be developed at the time. And as we know, they have gone on to become two of the largest emitters. And they got away with things, really. It expired in 2012. The United States also refused to sign, and their reasoning for that was they didn't want a negative impact on their economy. Economy was the most important thing, and if they were going to take this action, it was going to cost them. It was going to have a negative impact on their economy to put mitigation measures in place. So there was a real mixed bag in terms of the success of the Kyoto Protocol. There were some countries that made significant progress, but there were also lots of flaws to it. So, for example, the fact that China and India were not set any targets was a massive flaw. The fact that the USA were not signed up to it was a massive issue. And it was also the case that many countries were way off their target, and they didn't face any particular negative consequences for not meeting their targets. So overall, it wasn't particularly brilliant. And there was a huge amount of negotiation, and eventually a new international agreement was reached at the Paris Climate Convention back in 2015. So this is called the Paris Climate Convention. And the aim is to reduce global carbon emissions to below 60% of 2010 levels by 2050, and to keep warming below 2 degrees. And countries are going to be able to set their own voluntary targets. They're not going to be legally binding. There's also going to be significant transfer of money from the rich countries to help the poorer countries achieve their targets. And we've got a significant amount of arguing about the fact that if the world's developed countries like the UK and the USA were allowed to develop using fossil fuels, were allowed to industrialise using fossil fuels, is it fair to stop countries like China and India and countries coming up from developing in that way? We're preventing them from growing their economy. We're preventing them from developing. And they say that it's just not fair, just because we didn't know the consequences back during our industrial revolution. We were allowed to develop, we were allowed to move forward our economy in that way. Is it fair to stop them, or should we be transferring some sort of funds to them in order to compensate for that? Another issue is China, for example, says, well, yes, we are manufacturing a huge amount. Everything seems to be made in China. But who are we actually manufacturing these things for? And majority of the things that they're manufacturing are for the world's developed countries to then consume. And so they're arguing that the emissions that they're creating shouldn't necessarily be tied to them. Should they be transferred to us? Because ultimately we're the people that are buying and using the products that they're producing. So there are lots of issues with it. But when we look at the situation we're in now, there is no doubt that the countries that have created this problem of global warming that we're currently in are the world's developed countries. That's where all of the emissions have come from. So this is the Paris Climate Agreement. And again, America has been an important country in this, in that originally Obama signed them up to it. And then in June 2017, Donald Trump very famously pulled America out of the agreement. And he said, I represent the people of Pittsburgh, not Paris. And he said that it was a foreign attempt to seize American jobs and American wealth. And he pulled them out. Very interestingly, one of the first things that Biden did as he took office was to rejoin or start the process. It takes a couple of months, the Paris climate deal. So he's reversed that decision, and that is a very significant step forward. As we've said, if we want to have an international agreement that's successful, we need America on board, being such a big emitter. So the United Nations scientists have said that if we limit the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees, that would prevent small islands from being inundated by sea level rise. It will help millions of people avoid extreme weather, and it will limit the chances of an ice-free Arctic in the summer. We've got a very important conference coming up in November this year, which is going to be in the UK. It's going to be held in Glasgow, and this is going to be critical in terms of thrashing out the rules of this Paris Agreement. So that's going to be very interesting to watch as it develops. And the United States is going to have to rebuild trust with the rest of the world, having been out of the climate fold for so long. And lots of it is going to depend on action being taken by Biden to reverse a lot of the changes that Trump made that were anti the environment. So Biden has said, and he's got an ambitious list of climate goals, he is going to put the United States on a path to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which will be fantastic. He is going to restore the United States as a world leader in climate action. And he's appointed that former Secretary of State John Kerry as a special climate envoy. And one of the first things that he's done is to cancel the very controversial Keystone pipeline, which was going to run from Alberta in Canada down to Nebraska in the US, carrying oil that distance. So he's made a fantastic start, and it all looks much more promising moving forward. So another international agreement, another international strategy is cap and trade. And this is where each business is given a certain amount of emission space, a certain quota of emissions that they are allowed to produce each year. Now, if you are under your emissions cap, if you're under your quota, you can sell your spare space to another company who may well be over or reaching the point where they'll be over their emission space. And this is basically carbon credits. So it means that some of the biggest emitters are forced to pay some other more environmentally friendly companies for their emission space. But what it does mean is that overall, the emissions that we're creating are very tightly capped. And yes, people are buying and trading them between each other, but we know that we have capped them at a level that is going to be beneficial. This was an article in The Guardian saying that the world will need carbon sucking technology by the 2030s. So this is talking about carbon capture and storage that we've talked about in terms of that technology using to capture the carbon emissions and then pump the carbon and store it beneath the ground. You could also argue that planting trees is a carbon sucking technology because the photosynthesis will take that carbon out of the atmosphere. And then looking specifically at the water cycle and the management strategies. So if you remember, we talked about the United Nations RED scheme, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And if you remember, this is where we put a financial value on the forests, and the local people are given carbon credits if they don't chop the rainforest down. So giving an actual value to those trees in order to try to protect them. We also talked about the ARPA, the Amazon Regional Protected Areas Program, where you've got these areas that are protected, and if you protect the trees, you stabilize the regional water cycle, you are protecting that carbon photosynthesizing area of forest. That's really important. You're also protecting the genetic bank of trees moving forward in terms of the rainforest's biodiversity. And then in terms of water allocations, and this can be very difficult, making sure that different groups of people get their fair share of water. Agriculture, as we know, is the biggest consumer of water. 70% of water withdrawals, 90% of consumption. And we've got some pretty inefficient techniques. If you water with a sprinkler system moving up and down a field 24 hours a day, for example, you actually waste a huge amount of water. Not only are you watering the plants, but you're also watering the soil in between the plants and wasting a huge amount of water in that way, and also allowing evaporation to take place. There are lots of ways that we can use to try to improve this. So if you look at that photo at the bottom left, this is something called drip irrigation. So essentially you lay a series of hose pipes across your field, and by every 10 centimetres there is a hole in the hose pipe. And when you run the water through, the water drips out of those holes. So you plant your plants aligned up to those holes, and they're constantly being watered, but you're only watering the plants. You're not watering the soil around the plants. Therefore, you're using far less water. It's a much more efficient way of watering with far less wastage. Another thing that you can do is you can use terracing. So the third photo along, you've got the steps into the landscape. And that sort of terracing or contour ploughing is to try to keep the moisture in, stop it from just washing out, try and keep that soil from just blowing away. Another thing you can do is plant vegetative strips. So you can see in that picture on the far right, there's a strip of grass running down the field in order to intercept water, in order to bind the soil together with the roots. And then there's better water harvesting, so storing water in ponds and reservoirs, and even looking to recycle wastewater from agriculture and industry to try to utilise that water in a more efficient way. Sometimes we have big disagreements between different countries, between different states in terms of water. So the Colorado Basin in the United States has got these water agreements that divide up the water in the Colorado River between the states. Most of that area is using the water for agriculture. Then we've got drainage basin planning. So, for example, in the UK, each drainage basin has a drainage basin plan, trying to manage the different groups of people who are all wanting to take the water. So the farmers, the industry, the people, the domestic use, and then making sure that the wildlife and the recreation and leisure are also accounted for. So trying to put all of those different users together and come up with a plan that will make sure that everybody gets what they want. So we have lots of different regions you would have heard of, for example, Thames Water, Anglian Water, Severn Trent Water, that kind of thing. And each has their own management plan. Each has got targets to reduce the amount of water that they're using. There is a significant amount of leakage in the pipelines. A lot of the pipelines that carry our water into our houses are quite old, and there's a lot of water lost through leakage. So one of the big things the water companies are doing is trying to repair and renew that pipeline system in order to reduce the amount of wasted water through leaky pipes. And then also looking at the quality of the water, so getting farmers to reduce their fertiliser and pesticide use, and making decisions about where houses are built and housing developments are built in order to reduce flood risk and things like that. So you've got your questions there to summarise what we've talked about today, or you've done your notes as you've gone along. How about this question here? It's a 4-mark question. Study the figure which shows atmospheric CO2 changes from 1700 to 2015. Suggest how the changing carbon dioxide concentrations shown in the figure influence global management strategies for the carbon cycle. And this is a 4-mark question. So we look at the mark scheme. And this is 4 marks for AO2, so 4 marks for interpretation. And it says 1 mark for the interpretation of the graph to propose an appropriate global management strategy, and 3 marks for the justification of that strategy. So it's talked about on the left-hand side, some of the content you could put in would be appropriate management strategies could be wetland restoration or afforestation or sustainable agricultural practices. They're the 3 things that we've talked about. Developing that point, talking about wetlands acting as a carbon sink, as there's been a rapid increase in the CO2 in the atmosphere, and the wetlands will take that carbon in and they'll store it because of the very slow decomposition in the anaerobic conditions, which will then lock away that carbon for hundreds or thousands of years. And you could also talk about the fact that the degradation of the wetlands has created a significant source of emissions into the atmosphere. So restoring them will help to reduce that, for example. So have a go at answering that 4-mark question. And then this just finally is just some of the skills that you need for Earth's life support system. So in the spec it says you need to be able to interpret a climate graph, you need to be able to interpret a simple mass balance, you need to be able to look at rates of flow, you need to be able to make unit conversions, and you need to be able to analyse and present fieldwork data. So that is the end of the Earth's Life Support System module. And next lesson we're going to look at some summary notes or some sort of revision notes that we're going to be working on.